Um, Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Bermeo. I will be moderating today, and we're going to start off with some announcements of upcoming events for AGS. So on Tuesday, December 5th, a talk on confronting Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush, and the invasion of Iraq, which is a conversation with Melvin Leffler. Who's fantastic. And then coming up in the spring on Thursday, January 25th, AGS welcomes Lieutenant General Christopher Donahue, the Commanding General for the 18th Airborne Corps and Fort Liberty as part of the Marshall Military Series. On Thursday, February 1st, a talk on the titled Declassification Engine, What History Reveals About America's Top Secrets, and a conversation with Dr. Matthew Connolly. And then on February 5th, a conversation with Nick Kristof. So lots of very cool stuff coming up. Oh, Mike, yes, sorry.
Excellent. Is that better? Sorry about that. Okay, so today it is my great pleasure to be joined by Daniel Runde, who is the Senior Vice President and Director of the Project on Prosperity and Development and holds the William A. Schreyer, thank you, a chair in global analysis at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which I'm sure you have all heard of as a leading global think tank. So we're super excited to have you here, and in particular to have you talk about your book, The American Imperative, Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power, which just came out in 2022. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, it is available on Kindle. I know because I read it that way. Hopefully you get good royalties for Kindle sales too. But it is a very enjoyable read. So if you're worried that it's like heavy going, I was a little worried it might be heavy going. It's not heavy going, actually. It's extremely interesting and very readable. So highly recommend. So with that, I'd like to, thank you for being here with us. I'd like to start off the conversation by asking you, having had a chance now to read your book, it really gives this kind of, very high level, but also with lots of anecdotes and details of U.S.-China differences in their worldview and in their approach to other nations, particularly developing countries. And so if you could just kind of start off by giving us more of a sense of what you see as similarities and differences in U.S.-China policy in this area.
Thanks, Dr. Bermeo. I really appreciate being here at Duke. I'm really grateful to Dr. Peter Fever for having me. I'm really grateful to the American Grand Strategy Program for hosting this. And so I'm grateful that this is sort of a Duke-wide event. So thank you very much. And thank you all for investing time on a busy Tuesday evening after Thanksgiving. So I know you all are busy folks. So thank you. So I wrote this book because we're in a new age of great power competition. So the age that I grew up in, which was the post-Cold War, is over. So you could call it the post-Cold War, but that doesn't really kind of capture it, right? And so many people have sort of settled on this concept of we're in a new age of great power competition. So some people in Washington, so I did Newt Gingrich's podcast, I did Hugh Hewitt's radio show, and both of them read the book, like Dr. Bermeo. Thank you, Dr. Bermeo. And so they said, I liked your book, but I disagree with one premise of the book. And they said that we think we're in a second Cold War. So I'm eschewing the term second Cold War. Maybe this is something we could talk about, but I think this is, because I think this was part of the conversation. I'm going to stick with great power competition because I think that it paints one into a corner, or has sort of, at least as someone who grew up in the Cold War, it has a whole bunch of assumptions and a little bit fraught. So, but let's just say we're in an age of great power competition. My thesis is that we're competing with the Chinese Communist Party, and we're competing with Vladimir Putin, a little bit less so, but somewhat, with Vladimir Putin's murderous regime in Russia. We're not competing with the Russian people, and we're not competing with the Chinese people, but we're competing with the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin's murderous regime in Russia. And that most of this competition is not going to play out in China. It's not going to play out in Russia. It's going to play out in what might be characterized as the global south. It's going to play out in the developing world. It's going to play out in Russia, Africa, in Latin America, the Pacific Island states, Central Asia, Ukraine and Moldova, Southeast Asia, South Asia. It's going to play out sometimes in a military way, but most of the time, or much of the time, I would argue most of the time, it's going to be in a non-military, much of it's, at least so far, it's been non-military. And I would argue that that we talk a lot in Washington about China being a near peer competitor in the military sphere. I'm going to argue that the Chinese Communist Party is a near peer competitor in the non-military sphere. And so I wrote this book because they've got a different worldview, but they've got a number of things going for them. And my argument is we need to kind of up our game and kind of wake up and smell the coffee and get with the program. And that ultimately we're going to compete with the Chinese Communist Party in large. It's going to be, this competition is going to play out in the global south, and it's going to be in a non-military, much of it non-military. So what's our non-military strategy to respond to that? So I will say, Dr. Romero, when I've had this conversation in some parts of the global south, they don't even like having this discussion. They're kind of like, what, you know, we don't, but so I've been focused primarily on American audiences where I think, you know, I've gotten a lot more traction, I think. So I would say that, and I talk about this in the book, that, you know, I've been in Washington now for more than 20 years. I worked at USAID in the Bush administration, Bush 43. I worked at the World Bank Group for 4 years. I've been at CSIS for 13 years. I've chaired 2 government advisory committees, one on foreign aid and one on Africa for the U.S. Export-Import Bank. So this is sort of like this book is sort of like my 20 years in Washington. So on the specific question, Dr. Rambo, change the worldview, I'll share an anecdote. I traveled, as I was part of the foreign policy advisory team for Governor Romney when he ran for president. So I got invited to pretty cool, like, junkets and stuff was part of that. I don't get invited to those things now for some reason. I don't stop inviting me to these things, but not because I'm rude or anything, but you know, the campaign ended. But so I got invited like a bipartisan trip in the summer of 2012 to Africa. And it was in Liberia, and I asked one of the ministers, I said, well, what's the difference between us and China? He said, well, it's really simple. You guys do software and they do hardware. I didn't like that, but I thought that was pretty thoughtful. So that's an overly simplified, but I think pretty good. And I thought it was an interesting thing to say.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So I'm going to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit, though, right? So in your book, some of the anecdotes that you give are very specific about how differently China engages with countries than the United States does. In particular, you know, in the U.S., we often go into countries and we have ideas about their regimes and ideas about, you know, what we want to see politically, and China does not seem to approach countries this way, right? So can you talk a little bit about the differences there?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So a couple of things. One is, this is also an oversimplification, but when I've probably been to about 100 developing countries as part of my career. I'm sure, Dr. Vermeer, you've been to many countries as well. And okay, thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Sarah. So Sarah, I'd say, so, you know, in your professional career, I'm sure you've been to a lot. And one of the things I come across is, again, this is sort of an oversimplification and a little bit of a provocation when I've heard this, and I've heard this many, many times, like, well, when the U.S. comes, they wag their finger and they give us lectures. And China is more, I'm going to put it in these terms, these are Dan's terms, amoral about these things. And so they're pragmatically amoral, if I can put it that way. And so I think there's some, that's going to create, it creates dilemmas for us. So in the Cold War, we had a series of dilemmas about, do we work with kind of odious regimes that were with us? And I think every president has had this issue, but I would argue that this is increasing in this age where we're competing with China. So this is one of the things that sort of rhymes with the Cold War, where so our values are important. I think we should stand up for things like good governance and support for democracy and support for human rights. I'm on the board of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. I know the dean of the Stanford School is also on the board of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. So I've invested time in these issues. I care about this. I think, my theory of development is good governance and a growing formal private sector are sort of and so I would say that, having values and speaking up for these things, I think the world is a less thuggish place because the United States is led on things like human rights. I think there's still a lot of corruption in the world, but it's harder to be corrupt because of sort of like the United States and others have stood up for this. There's a heck of a lot more democracies in the world. If you go look at like the Freedom House Index of freedom in the world from say 40 years ago or 50 years ago, the number of countries that are free and the number of countries free today, the world's a lot freer place. Yes, there's been democratic backsliding, and I know there are people who will say that we're in a democracy recession. That's true, but if you go look from say 50 years ago, it's a lot freer place. Anyway, so having said all that, we do, there's a presumption that we are going to try and lead with our values on governance or democracy or human rights. And across administrations, we try to do that. Even in the Trump administration, I was with the Trump administration person recently. It's like, oh, and we're not doing, if he wins again, we're not doing that human rights stuff. Like, what are you talking about? I said, like, are you concerned about like the authoritarian regime in Venezuela? Yeah, I'm concerned about that. I said, what do you think about Cuba? Do you like the Castro regime or whatever you call it these days? And no, we don't like that. I said, yeah, that's bad. Thumbs down. Okay. How about Nicaragua? You like the Daniel Ortega? No, I don't like that. Well, I'm Catholic. I don't like how Christians are being treated in the Middle East. Are you concerned about that? Yeah, I'm concerned about that. I said that this is the building blocks of a human rights agenda. You just don't call it that, right? So I mean, my point is every administration has a human rights agenda. It's just there's some so China does come in with kind of a moral approach. The other thing that they do is they'll also say, I'm going to give you all like a turnkey thing. You want a road, you want an airport, you want a telecom system, you want a railroad. I'm going to do everything. I'm going to, you sign this piece of paper. I'm going to build this for you. I'm going to lend you the money. I'm going to provide you I'm going to bribe you. A lot of times there's bribery involved. There's going to be, yeah, maybe I'll bring in, there's a little bit of I think this still remains true. Their preference is to bring in folks from China to do the stuff. Now, do they do that in every instance? Not anymore. They were doing a lot more of that 10 years ago, but are they still doing a lot? Yeah. So then we'll say to our partner friends, well, okay, well, one of the reasons I think they've been able to step into there's been a void created. And one of the reasons I wrote this book, The American Imperative, is that there have been voids by kind of the Western offer on global development. One of them has been in infrastructure, that it's really hard. Like if you want to get an infrastructure project approved at the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, they have to do a whole bunch of things. They got to like make sure like native peoples are consulted if they're impacted, or like in a big time environmental impact assessment. And we got to make sure that there's not too much bribery going on, right? And we got to make sure that we hire local people to do the work. Now, these are all legitimate things. I'm all for all this. The problem is they'll come in and say, well, we don't have to do anything. So they blow all that stuff up. So they'll do horrible things sometimes, or they bribe local people, and that creates other things. But they get this project done in some really speedy way. We'll then say, well, that was like a shoddy project. Well, if you're a tin pot dictator and you have a chance of getting like a crappy bridge or no bridge, you're going with a crappy bridge. So I think that's like one of the challenges is I think we have to, and one of the other reasons I wrote this book, The American Imperative, is like my message is we can't fight something with nothing. So and I think one of the things that happened was, whether it's Belt and Road or sort of like the larger infrastructure agenda, some of that was for a lot of domestic reasons within China, but they were answering kind of an unmet demand that sort of Western models of development were not kind of answering the mail on. And so I don't know if that gets to your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then thinking about, kind of so we can see why this is problematic for the United States, that there's this other superpower out there or emerging superpower out there that's doing this work. I guess what's in it for China, right? So there's a lot of different narratives, maybe all of them true, right? One of them is they want access to cheap natural resources. Another is they want countries to vote with them in the UN on issues related to Taiwan.
Yeah.
Another is they just want to put a thumb in the eye of the United States, right? So what is it that China, because this is expensive what they're doing, and China's not a rich country, or they're a big country, but they're not a rich country. So what's in it for them?
Okay, so great, thank you. So I'd say a couple things. So one is they had at one point, I'm going to say go back to like 2010, 2013, 2015. And I have several chapters in the book about China. I'm not a China expert per se. I mean, I play one on TV, but I'm not, but I think if you want to talk about global development today, you have to be able to talk about kind of the arc of development of China and sort of how they're thinking about these things. But I would say that, and I wrote this book through the lens of great power competition because I wanted to reach I wanted to reach international development folks, but I wanted to reach people who were thinking about a broader set of issues, foreign policy people in the national security community, people worried about grand strategy. But I wanted to be able to reach them as well, because I think this is an important part of our power. And anyway, so what's in it for China? So several things. So one is that China was sitting on like $2 trillion of money. We bought socks and toys from them, and we gave them dollars, like Saudi Arabia had those petrodollars in the 70s. They had like the equivalent a lot of petrodollars from all the socks we bought and all the plastic toys we bought. And so they've got $2 trillion bucks, and they had to quote unquote do something with that money. They could either like put that money in American debt, like buy our debt from our, for our finance our deficit, or they could do other things with that money. They also said, okay, well, we're in the process of kind of developing a series of Chinese national champions, whether it's like construction firms or tech companies or telecom companies. And so we're going to use that money to help to kind of go out and like, these folks we can only build so much road in China. We've built like so many 8-lane superhighways in China. We need to like do stuff with these construction companies. And it's also a way of saying, instead of putting money to financial assets, I'll put it into like railroads and roads and airports in other parts of the world. And at the same time, so that's one rationale. So they had this money and they had the spare capacity. Let me put it that way. Second, they had some grand strategy designs in terms of saying, okay, well, I consider myself a country from the global south. I want to have win-win partnerships. Infrastructure is not being met. This is a win-win thing. I'm going to frame it in a positive, forward-looking agenda that speaks to the hopes and aspirations of China's friends and potential friends. And I'm going to create this Belt and Road thing. Third, there's a whole bunch of things around, well, I don't want to be, I don't want to have the Straits of Malacca be cut off if I want to get oil. So I'm going to have all these alternate infrastructure things that if the U.S. Navy says I'm going to cut off the Straits of Malacca, I can get oil and gas through, other means, and I can get other things through other means. So there was that. Then whether it has to do with, say, airports or ports, there's this whole concept about dual use, right? So if you look at some of those ports, it seems to fit like their aircraft carriers or their submarines in a super, super convenient way. That's kind of a little weird and kind of sort of a coincidence or something. Or the airports that they build seem to be able to kind of take kind of their, dual use military purpose kind of a thing. And that kind of like, how that happened, right? So there's that. The other thing is that, and I think this has not been fully appreciated, is they're in the process of doing two things. One is they're in the process through the unholy trinity of Huawei, ZTE, and Alipay about to control the digital rails of the future. And so if you think about like, what does that mean? Well, there's like a couple things. There's like a national security thing. There's like an intel thing. But the other thing is with the rise of AI, and, I'm like 51, so I'm like telling on myself here. So like this AI thing is like a little, I know you guys, you younger people know about more. I got a kid who's like did a science project on AI. So like that's everything I learned about AI, I learned from my 17-year-old. But you need a lot of data. right, for AI to work. You guys, I mean, we use AI for the data and the algorithm and the thing, right? Well, they're in the process of vacuuming up a whole lot of data. So if you're buying, if I go buy a Coca-Cola in Nairobi and I have the control of the digital, that's being vacuumed up and sent to Beijing and put into somebody's ZTE or Alipay's algorithm. It's not, you know, and so that means their AI is going to could be better than our AI in theory because they can. And the other thing is they don't respect, you know, all the privacy stuff that we're concerned about in the West or human rights. Like, oh, hey, so and so's personal health data. Like, can we agree that's probably, you know? So I think you get the idea that. So there's this. So they've got multiple things going on, but I do think one of the temptations has been in the United States to say to people, don't take the Chinese bridge. And I'm hoping you guys are all giving me a waiver, right? When I say China, I'm talking Chinese Communist Party, okay? So I'm getting a hall pass tonight, right? Okay. When I say that, I'm talking Chinese Communist Party. Don't cancel me, right? You know. And so when I say Russia, I'm talking about Vladimir Putin's murderous regime. I do think we need to have a strategy. I don't talk a lot about this in the book. But we need a strategy for engaging the Chinese people. And I'm going to say something more controversial. We need to figure out how we're going to engage the Russian people. And that's a tough one, but we need to figure that one out too. Okay. But, sorry, we can't go around to developing countries saying, don't take the Huawei if we don't have a price or quality competitive alternative. And guess what? We don't have one right now. We can't say to them, don't take don't let them build the big crappy hydroelectric dam in Uganda with a crack in it. If we can't enable an alternative, that doesn't mean we have to compete with them dollar for dollar, but we can't just go around and say, well, don't take that. Oh no, you don't need that port. Like, what are you talking about? You don't need that port. Like, they need the port. And so maybe much of the time they need the port. Sometimes they don't need the port. Like in Sri Lanka, maybe they didn't need the port. But the point is, we better be really careful about saying, like, oh, don't take that money or don't take the Huawei. Same thing with vaccines. So the story I often tell, Sarah, is during COVID, so you all went to TGI Fridays, right? Right. Okay. So I'm serious. You know, I'm serious. So TGI Fridays. You're really dating yourself. Am I dating myself? It's like, okay. So TGI Fridays, you get a buzzer when the table's not ready, right? You know what I'm talking about? They give you the buzzer, they buzz you. Okay. So we went to a number of countries and said, Pfizer, Moderna, that's for us. That's called vaccine nationalism, right? You've heard of vaccine nationalism. So like, that means we're going to prioritize Pittsburgh over Paraguay. So we said to a lot of developing countries, suck it up. Here's your TGI Fridays buzzer, and we'll buzz you in about a year, and we'll get you. So that created a void, right? So there was a rumor. So there were several examples of this in the Western Hemisphere. I testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on this specific issue. I know this to be, I believe this to be true. What am I going to say? So the Dominican Republic, which is led by a pro-American government, had committed to the Trump administration they were going to re-recognize Taiwan before COVID. They'd also committed to the Trump administration they would not put Huawei in their telecom system. So COVID happens, we give them the TGI Fridays treatment and say, suck it up. We'll hang in there for 12 months and we'll get you the good stuff in 12 months. So China came with a plane full of the crappy stuff, right? You know what I'm talking about, Sinovac, and we can say, oh, the WHO, that's not cold chain, and all, you know what I'm talking about, right? That the public health people say, oh, it's not so good, and efficacy, right? All that stuff. They had a plane full of the crappy stuff. Sitting on the tarmac, said, well, we've heard a rumor that you're going to re-recognize Taiwan. Now, I've got these wonderful Sinovac vaccines here. I mean, you wouldn't want to do something that stupid, would you? Oh, no, we're not going to do that. You know, we have a very fine telecom firm called Huawei, and we'd like you to consider including Huawei in your telecom. That sounds like a great idea. We're going to do that. So I don't know. I mean, people think about like soft power as like, well, that's kind of fluffy, hippy dippy. I mean, that sounds pretty tough to me, right? So my point, and we talk a lot of, there's like in public health, people talk about like vaccine diplomacy. That's like weaponized vaccine diplomacy. They're not following the Marquis of Queensberry rules, right? So my point is like, if we avoid, whether it's telecom or vaccines or infrastructure or development finance, like there's a debt crisis in the developing world right now. It's going to have all sorts of impacts on global development. And people are going to have to say, I'm going to pay my interest to China, or I'm going to pay teachers in Africa. That's a thing. Okay. And so it's going to be a huge speed bump to kind of global progress. And China's not, in the past, we'd have gotten Paul Volcker and a bunch of guys, it had been a bunch of guys, right, like 30 years ago, in a smoking cigars. And they'd have gotten in a room and fixed this. They'd have had like, oh, I'll take a debt haircut. Well, guess what? China doesn't want to do that. They're not a member of what's called the Paris Club. They're an observer to the Paris Club, which is like one of these rule systems of the global liberal international order, right? And so my point is like, what do they want? They want a bunch of different things. Ultimately, what I think they want, and what I've described here, is these are the Lego building blocks of an alternative order. And so if you just each did like a thought experiment, like what would a world be like led by the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin? Like, just think about that for 30 seconds. Like, would that be like a sucky world or what? I would argue that would be a terrible, terrible thing. And I haven't had anyone yet tell me in an American audience, I would love it if the Chinese Communist Party was like led the world and they set the global rules. But they're making a play to do that. So each of these things talk about telecom or vaccines. We haven't talked about the multilateral system yet, the roads or the development finance. These are Lego building blocks in an order. It's not the whole thing. There's other things too. But this is an attempt. But if we all just kind of do a little thought experiment, what things you most care about? Climate change, human rights, religious freedom, good governance, democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of association, economic stability. How about like peace or some kind of conflict management? Like, does anyone here believe that Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin are better stewards of any of those challenges than sort of the imperfect coalition of the willing led by the United States? I haven't had anyone tell me like, no, that would be awesome. I would like, even the MAGA people I've met who are like, no one's been like, oh my gosh, I'm totally ready for that. Like, yes, I would like, now I've had some people in the global South kind of just to kind of tweak me. Yes, I would like that. I want China to do that, but I don't really think they mean that, right? It's just to kind of, because I represent something, they kind of do that to kind of tweak me, right? So they want a lot of different things. And the reason I wrote this book is to say, like, we need to like, I don't want to get in a shooting war with them. I'm not necessarily sure I want a cold war with them, but we need to understand like we're in a different age. And so we need to up our game. A lot of it's like development stuff. A lot of it's development adjacent. And some of it's like 2 degrees of separation from development. It's like commercial diplomacy, certain other things that are important that are non-military, that aren't like ATACMs or battleships, but are kind of what might be called soft power, right? So let's agree like the global South is kind of like an imprecise term, but like it's probably as good as it gets, right? If someone has a better term, like I'm open to it. And also the soft power term is kind of a little fluffy and sounds a little unserious and it's not taken very seriously, but like it encompasses a lot of, it includes development, but it includes a series of these other things. And so my point is, we're going to be competing in this not a lot of non-military things because they're a near peer soft power competitor. And if we leave a void, they have the ability to fill it. Doesn't mean they will, but they have the ability to fill it. Many of the things that we used to take for granted, like either we'll get to you when we can on vaccines, like take a number and you can wait. They're like, okay, we'll get the crappy ones now. Or like, hey, we're not doing big hydro dams anymore. They'll do the big hydro dam, right? So those are the sorts of things we have to understand.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I want to stay with China for a minute, and then I want to pivot and talk about, what the U.S. response should look like, right? If you were, so I'm going to ask you a couple of times now to put on your crystal ball gazing hat or whatever it is, right? How, what do you think is China's staying power on all of this, right? So you have China is a country that is huge economy, but not a rich country, has a lot of domestic needs. In some ways, and now this is unfair because you've already said you don't want to think about this as the Cold War, but in some ways could potentially remind you of the Soviet Union in the 1980s overextending itself abroad, but not taking care of things at home. Or are they just at the beginning of their upward trek and they're going to be, China is the wave of the future, and we gotta take that seriously. I mean, do you have, or is it just too soon to tell?
No, I think so it's not totally a flip answer, but I would say we have to prepare for the worst, hope for the best and prepare for the worst. So what I mean by that is, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, there's been so look, I would be thrilled if they had a big financial crisis and we're taking down a couple of pegs, but I'm not supposed to say that, but like that's what I really think. But I think many of you follow, or if you're all thoughtful people. So, there's been discussion of late about kind of peak China and the problems they have of debt and the problem they have of demography, the problem they have of kind of like certain things in the structure of their economy. Well, I mean, here's a question for you all to think about. Who here, when they're graduating, is moving to Beijing? Anybody? No, I'm quite serious. Who's moving next year? When they finish, they're moving as soon as they graduate to Beijing. Is anyone doing that? Who here is moving to Moscow? Anybody moving to Moscow here? Why is that? Sorry to be slightly more provocative. Who's moving to China or Russia illegally? Like who's crossing some river to get there without papers? I mean, North Korea doesn't count. Okay. But my point to you is like, they have a problem. They have a talent problem too. And so, we have a discussion about kind of immigration in this country. We have about 1 million people that come to the United States legally every year. Then there's sort of a conversation about, okay, well, how many people don't come here via that route or whatever. But my point is like, I actually think as long as there's a line outside the U.S. consulate in foreign countries, we're going to be okay. Because we're going to get the best people. We're going to get the smartest people. And so my point is, they have a debt problem. They have a talent problem. Like I said, like nobody here said to me, so I've done this 95 times as 95th book talk. I ask this question every time, like, who's moving to China? And no one's raising their hand. And I ask, who's moving to Russia? And no one says like, oh, I'm moving to Moscow tomorrow. No one says that. Why is that? So they've got a lot of challenges. Their demography is terrible. Their forced abortion of girls, 40 million girls, which is like a disgusting, outrageous, deeply offensive thing. That's kind of people tiptoe around, but is for real. They're going to pay a terrible price for that. And not just is it immoral, but it's also disgusting. But it's going to have all sorts of impact on the growth. So they took the one child policy and like went to like an extreme, and now it's like too late. Like they have like Portugal levels of births, and no one's moving there. So that's why you're seeing all this stuff on like robots and stuff, right? They're trying to like, you either have migration or you have productivity improvements through robots. So my point is, they do have a lot of challenges, but they're like the second largest economy in the world. And even if they had like a 10-year Japan style problem, they're still going to be part of the global furniture. They're still going to be a big, economy, and we're still going to have to reckon with them. So we can hope for like a big financial crisis or two and have a big housing thing. But they're going to be with us for the rest of your careers. We're going to have to think about how do we like not get into war with them. And we also need to understand, like, if we choose to like say, well, we're going to take a timeout on global leadership in topic X, they will continue to have some ability and sometimes a significant ability to fill voids we choose to leave. whether us or the West.
All right.
So let's switch then and talk about the U.S., response to China, but more broadly, the U.S. approach to non-rich countries, right? So the U.S. approach to developing countries. And it strikes me, now I don't have your experience in government, right? But it strikes me as an outsider looking in that there is not a coherent U.S. strategy right now, and that there hasn't been for some time. And so what, I get, a two-part question, like what would, if you can't replace something with nothing, well, what should our something be, right? And, and what do we need to get there?
So thanks. So I've done a lot of these because I'm really concerned about this. And I think I'm going to date myself and say, I think since the financial crisis of 2008, the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war, like there's been a temptation in the United States, more on the right, but a little bit on the left, to take a timeout on global leadership. Now that's different than saying, I'm going to hand over the keys. I'm saying it's all just one big misunderstanding, Chinese Communist Party. Here are the keys to the system. You can have the renminbi be the currency. We're all going to learn Mandarin, and we're going to let, have a techno-authoritarian state, and the human rights and democracy are going to take a way big backseat. And, that's an extreme, but what my point is that there's just been a temptation. We've had a little bit of a nervous breakdown in terms of saying, look, I'm not sure I want China to run the world, but I would just like a break. I would like a sabbatical from American leadership, but it doesn't work that way. And so I think it's expressed itself in a lot of different ways, whether it's in the trade agenda. Like if you look at our trade agenda that reflects this, I think how many people on the right in particular, since well, why we do this foreign aid stuff and why we have to participate now. I think a couple of things, I think, I do think that the reason I wrote this book in the frame of the great power competition is like, as I said earlier, I haven't had anybody say to me, like, I'm cool with the idea. And so when I work with China leading the world, and when the Trump administration came in, they stupidly said, we're going to get rid of OPIC. Well, this is it's like an obscure but important specialized agency. Then they quickly turned around and said, that's an error. We're going to put it on steroids. And I helped them do that. Then they came in and said, we're going to get rid of the Export-Import Bank. And that's a colossally stupid thing to do. So a lot of what do you do at a think tank? People ask me, what do you do on a think tank? I'd say a chunk of it, like a third of it, is stopping stupid things from happening, is like a big part of the job. It's not like thinking deep thoughts and coming down from the mountaintop and dispensing pearls of wisdom. It's like trying to stop colossally stupid things from happening. So they came and turned their view around on the Export-Import Bank. Then on the issue of the UN system. So Republicans really like to hate on the United Nations. Now the United Nations and the multilateral system is a really complicated thing. There's 130 technical agencies of the multilateral system. Most of them have been set up since World War II, not all of them. And most of them were set up with American leadership. And we're the biggest condo fee payer of a lot of this stuff. And there's a reason there are forms of collective action on security, collective action on development, collective action on sort of other, they're vessels for collective action. So what's happened on that is that China has become a bigger and bigger player in a lot of these institutions, and great power competition has come to the multilateral system. So the Trump administration, I'd say the most interesting article I've read on any kind of foreign policy issue was an article I read in Foreign Policy magazine called Outfoxed and Outgunned, which was like a 2,000 or 3,000 word description of the election for the Food and Agriculture Organization. Now, if you'd ask me, what the hell is the Food and Agriculture Organization? I kind of know what it is. It's about food and agriculture, right? We know that, right? But what the heck is it? It's I wouldn't consider it one of the top most important institutions. I did a big project on the multilateral system after this, and China, I can come back to what it is in a minute, but it's a moderately important organization. It's not the most important, but China has more embassies than the United States of America does today. So that matters if you want to like run a campaign for one of these things. So their guy, and it was a guy, got 120 votes. He spoke perfect English, perfect French, has a PhD in agricultural something, right? From like a good, like from Duke, like from some good place, right? And then, yes, as a member of the Chinese Communist Party, you betcha, that candidate got 120 votes. The Trump administration, like, brought their D team to this issue. The person who ran the campaign was like later fired for a whole bunch of like sketchy stuff and was like incompetence and malpractice. The American-backed candidate got 12 votes. This had never happened before. So then even the Trump administration, like, can we all kind of agree we're probably not super into the UN, was kind of like, ooh, this doesn't feel so good. Having my teeth kicked in kind of hurts. This stinks. So 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from a friend of mine who I knew in politics. And he says, Dan, I just have been Senate confirmed as the U.S. ambassador to the UN for the Geneva agencies. And it's like, anyways, it's an important post. He says, my most important job, this is in September of 2019. He says, we just had our butts kicked in this FAO thing and it stunk. We didn't like that. And maybe we needed to pay more attention to the UN system. I was like, yeah, maybe we ought to, that'd probably be a good idea. And he said, we're worried about China is putting forward the resume candidate equivalent for something called WIPO. Now, who knows what WIPO is in this room? Now, okay, so you get a gold star, but who else knows what WIPO is? Okay, so I'm a pretty well-read person. I had no idea what the hell WIPO was when someone's like, Runde, can you help me with this WIPO thing? I'm like, what the hell is WIPO? So if Peter and I invented a new ballpoint pen, so 30 years ago, we'd have put together a blueprint, send it in the mail to the Patent and Trade Office. They'd have opened up an envelope. They'd have done a Xerox copy of the blueprint and gone to a big paper filing cabinet of other blueprints and seen if like, okay, Peter and Dan's pen was truly unique. Then they'd have done one more thing. They'd have made another Xerox copy, put it in the airmail, and then they'd have sent it to a much bigger filing cabinet of blueprints in Geneva, Switzerland at the World Intellectual Property Organization. So they're like the Major League Baseball Commission of Intellectual Property with a really big database. So fast forward by 30 years, PDF, CAD drawing, cloud computing, right? All the words, right? So think about it. So whoever runs that gets to control, like, well, who's going to run the cloud, right? You kind of play this out, play the string out a little bit. You kind of get the, well, okay, advanced economies, what percentage of an advanced economy is intellectual property? 30%, 40%. So so even the Trump administration was like, well, maybe this isn't such a good idea, right? And so I think you get the idea because you could say, well, I'm going to hire peoplesliberationarmy.com cloud computing company to run the cloud. And I'm going to rethink the junior hiring staffing strategy because we need a lot more Chinese Communist Party members at the junior ranks. If you guys don't think this is a thing, I'm telling you it's a thing, okay? So the first thing I said was, there like a WIPO for dummies? Because I didn't know what the hell it was. So me and a young person spent a week putting together a WIPO for dummies. Well, what the hell is it? Who's had the job? Who votes? What's the timeline? What the heck is this thing? I did an op-ed and then I worked, that guy who I knew from politics got 2 R's and 2 D's to do a letter saying you got to pay attention to the, from the Hill saying you got to pay attention to this to kind of get the system to respond. And then we did a series of meetings at CSIS with the WIPO for Dummies paper, with the White House, with the right people leading the campaign and industry saying, okay, there's 10 candidates, ABC, anybody but China. There's other 9 can't tell me who it's going to be. And then we got to run a campaign because like, we can't do this anymore. We can't, this isn't 1995 anymore. So in 1995, we were like, we're going to stop paying our UN dues. We're going to get out of the UN. That was, if you're old enough, you remember that. We can't do that anymore. So the thing I was most worried about when Trump said, I'm going to quit the WHO, when I think that guy ought to have been fired, the guy who ran the WHO. First of all, nobody, like, it was like getting up in this room and like, everyone follow me out the room and like, no one follows them out of the room. But the second thing I was more worried about Like, what's the dues for the WHO for the United States of America? Like 200 million bucks? Now I know for public health people, like it's so expensive. Like China's got $2 trillion in the bank. They could have said, okay, we'll cover America's dues. And we'd look like losers and chumps, stupid. So like that's a thing now. It's like, oh, we're not gonna pay, we're getting out. Like my biggest worry was they're like, that's great. We'll cover your expenses because you're obviously a chump country. So we can't pull stuff like that anymore. So anyway, so that's why I wrote this book, especially for people who are a little bit more skeptical. Like I think I'm preaching to the choir here. Like I'm not gonna get a lot of argument. But what I'm interested in is socializing the ideas that say, like, we're gonna have to like, so what do we need to do that's different? Well, we can't blow off the multilateral system. We probably need to do a better job of enabling alternatives in things like infrastructure. So my other thing is I've got like, what should things like AID be doing? Like I spent a year in my basement because of COVID and so did you. Like I'm not up for that, but there's going to be other funny name diseases, right? The public health people are going to tell me that, zoonotic transfer and all the words, right? Well, I want like a better early warning system and I want like better surge capacity of vaccines so that when the DR next time, instead of giving the TGI Fridays buzzer, I don't want to give them the TGI Fridays buzzer. I want to give them the good stuff. Right. The other thing is like, I also figured out like when they said they were going to cut off my pills and cut off my ventilators, you know what I'm talking about, right? China said we're going to cut you off. Those are grounds for a divorce. We're going to have a different relationship. Maybe they can bring their new spouse to diplomatic Thanksgiving. Maybe I can sit with China and watch my kid graduate from diplomatic high school, but and we could have like a blended Christmas card of our blended families together and diplomatic Christmas card picture. You know what I'm talking about, but we're going to have a different kind of relationship with China. So there's lots of fancy terms for this: China +1, resilient supply chains, nearshoring, friendshoring, allied shoring, reshoring. You've heard all these words. That's a result of that. So we ought to be using our foreign aid, our ODA, our DF development finance stuff, or ECA stuff as WD-40. You guys know what WD-40 is, like lubricant, like to lubricate like shifts to all that stuff. China plus whatever you want to call it. And there's a whole bunch of things, and we've written think tank papers that talk about this. So that'd be another thing. Then I don't know what the hell we're going to do about this, but we need a price competitive, quality competitive coalition to beat the unholy trinity of Huawei, ZTE, and Alipay. We don't have that yet. So I want the coalition of somebody else to show up. So we're probably going to need some foreign aid for that. We're going to need the DFIs and the ECAs and the MDBs and the alphabet soup of those folks to help on that. But like, I don't want the digital rails of the future controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And if you thought about it for a few minutes, you'd say, it's not such a good idea either. So we need to figure that out. So close the digital divide in a better way. Nearshoring, shifting global supply chains, pandemic, whatever, right? Like pandemic preparedness surge thing. Those are all things like AID needs to be doing more of. I'd also say I want to make it the world, we're always going to have corruption. Corruption's like cholesterol. So we have corruption in the United States. We have corruption. We look around and you see news articles about corruption. So like, we're not a perfect society, but it's like managing your corruption, your cholesterol. Corruption is like, it's not a fixable thing. It's a thing you have to manage. So I want to make it harder for them to go around the world bribing people. Like their MO is to bribe people. So we should make it harder, not because it's just good for development and meeting SDG goals or whatever. I believe in good governance, but we should do it not only for all those reasons, but to make it harder for the bad guys to be bad. So if you said to me, like, there's a space for a lot, so I think there's a number of things I'd like to see AID do in the development space that are response. Some of it's a great power competition, some of it responds to COVID, and some of it responds to some of the things I think that our partners want. I would just say one other thing. I think we need to do a better job of enabling higher education and training. And so there's a youth bulge in Africa. There's going to be 2 billion Africans. There's now 1 billion Africans, there's going to be 2 billion Africans. 25 years now, there are going to be more African citizens than citizens of China and India combined. So there's going to be, in your lifetime, for the younger people here, Africa is going to be a much more preponderant and important pull of gravity than it is today. So I want to, when Africa looks back on, and it's going to be, much of Africa is going to be an incredible success story. I want them to look back and say the United States of America and the West was a good partner in that trajectory of success for Africa. It's going to happen. I don't want them saying at the Academy Awards ceremony of like countries, and when they say, I want to thank the Chinese Communist Party for being my best partner. That's a bad outcome for us. So we need to be, we are a great development partner in Africa, but we need to be also seen as a better economic partner for Africa.
Great. And really, really important points on Africa there. I want to, one last question from me, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. But what you're talking about, the U.S. needing to have a vision, needing to be engaged, it requires, I think, both an executive branch and a legislative branch that are on board, right? And right now we have a legislative branch that is not, and I mean they're even divided at the moment, at least, on aid for Ukraine, right? So what are your thoughts about this? I mean, during the Cold War, aiding a country that was invaded by Russia, or at that time Soviet Union, would have been a no-brainer, right? But that's not a no-brainer right now. Even that's getting resistance. So how do we think about that in this broader context that you're talking about?
So thank you for asking it, Sarah. I think that so we have, so I can quibble about, I think the Biden administration is largely kind of on board with what I've just been talking about. And I think that many people, largely there's some people in the Republican Party who are not down with what I'm talking about. So I think, as I said earlier, the gateway drug for all these folks is China. I'm a big supporter of the Ukrainian cause. Like, I've been running a big commission on Ukraine reconstruction at CSIS. I do think that, there's a, I don't think I need to make the case to this group that if Ukraine collapses or sort of like Russia gets away with it, there's a whole bunch of bad things that come as a result of that. One is that, China, which is a totally amorally pragmatic society, is going to be like, okay, well, we want is for Russia to have such a bad experience that they're like, I would like to take a timeout for 100 years on invading Ukraine. Right? You never hear the Russians say, I'm going to invade Finland. Why is that? You guys know why, right? Right? They may have a couple of shots of vodka and say, like, I'd really like to invade Finland, but they don't do it. They have simple thoughts about Finland, but they don't do it. Why is that? Because they had their hands burned. So we need them to have such a bad experience in Ukraine that even if they get drunk and they say, oh man, that's really mine, and they say all those crazy offensive things about Ukraine, but they're not going to act on it, because I don't think we're going to change their mind right now. So I think if we let them, if they somehow, and I think a lot of it will depend on kind of American support, and if we're seen as pulling the plug, and that we kind of, that it will embolden China on Taiwan. Like, they're watching, there are some people that would argue that, like, if Ukraine had folded, that that China would already be marching on Taiwan. So there's that. I also think there's also, I don't think, as I said earlier, I think we've had a little bit of a nervous breakdown since the financial crisis. I think unfortunately, the Iraq war, I think also has, is like for all of us who are kind of in living memory, remember that had, there was the surge and other things, but I'd say, and also sort of the pullout in Afghanistan. There's it's created kind of like a, I don't know, like a crisis of confidence or something like that. And so I would just say that, like a midlife crisis or something, but I would just say that, I don't need to make all the arguments why it's important, but I would just say the consequences of screwing this up aren't going to just stay in Ukraine. Like, they're going to be in China. It's going to impact a whole series of other kind of concerns that we have. And if people think like he's just going to be, quote unquote, satisfied with kind of swallowing up Ukraine, we're all kidding ourselves. Whether it's Moldova or the Baltic, he'll go for the Baltic states, which are NATO members, and we're going to have World War III, or Kazakhstan. Like he's like a neo-czar. He wants to like put together some kind of Russian empire and put that thing back together again. So, um, so I just think that so some of it is weapons. So sure, and so a lot of Republicans are like, I'm happy sending weapons as long as they're not stolen or sold on some secondary market or something. But like cutting a check for what's called budget support or financing, like keeping the lights on or paying pensions for retirees in Ukraine, like why the hell do I have to do that? Well, there's a whole series of reasons as to why, but I think the other thing is like how many Ukrainian American voters are there in the second district of West Virginia? Congressional district. How many? Zero? I think it's zero. I know because my friend's the congressman from the second district of West Virginia, and like he voted the first time for the package, and this was his reasoning. And he's not a stupid person. He went to Dartmouth. He's a very bright guy. He said, Dan, I voted for this because my mom is from Cuba, and she was a prisoner in Castro's regime for a while, and then she escaped. And so the Ukrainians are like the Cuban people, and Russia's like the communists. And so the communists are bad, and that's why I did it. So it wasn't like, here, read my complicated white paper, or, I've got this clever argument. Let me tell you about grand strategy. Or he was like, it was like a super emotional thing that had to do with his mom. He got a whole bunch of calls in his district crapping on him for voting that way. His staff, who are kind of isolationist curious, were like, why are you doing this? So we're going to have to figure it out. I think in the case of Ukraine, we're going to need like an APAC for Ukraine. We're going to ultimately need to figure out, we're going to need to have like a political, like an organized political exercise to enable Ukraine to ultimately become a member of NATO. And then we've done this whole thing on Ukraine reconstruction. We've done 30 seminars and 20 background papers. You have trouble sleeping at night, like you can read we have not boiled the ocean on Ukraine reconstruction, okay? But we've done a lot, okay? We did a commission that met 4 times, the high-level commission, global group, smart people. My deepest thought after all that work is we need to align. There's not enough foreign aid. There's not enough clever white papers. There's not enough diplomatic demarches or conferences that are going to change the trajectory of Ukraine. What's going to change the trajectory of Ukraine is for them to join the European Union. Now, that's like a kind of like a globalist thing to say. Yes, it's a globalist thing to say. So for American audiences, what I say to them is, and you'll appreciate this, what would you have done to join the coolest fraternity or the coolest sorority in college? What hazing would you have put up with? Right? I think this is a Greek life place, right? Right. So you can tell me, oh, they're all cool. Okay. I don't believe that, but okay. But like, what would you have done? So join the EU is like the coolest fraternity on campus. Now in America, like, what the hell's the EU? Who cares? There aren't people want to leave. There's gobs of money. It's the cool kids club. It means like you're a real country. So that's what's going to change the trajectory of Ukraine. So we have to align all our foreign aid, all the meetings, all the stuff to like joining the cool kids club. So that's the pull, and this is the push. So, okay, so like Poland, right? So international. Here's a PhD question for somebody. Why does Poland have $16,000 per capita, and why does Ukraine have $4,500 per capita? It's kind of like, I'm not gonna say it's copy paste. Like, so someone's here is Polish, gonna be explaining, oh no, it's super different. And if there's someone in Ukraine, they, oh, Runde, how can you say that? The main difference, there's a couple differences, and you could list all of them, but the big one is that Poland had a clear path to joining the EU and a clear path to joining NATO. I would argue that's what it is. And if you've been to Poland, it's amazing. Like if you've been to Warsaw, it's impressive. And I like Kiev, but Warsaw is more impressive. So my point is, we need to align. We need to get help. We need to have sustained attention like we had in the Cold War. We're going to have to support Ukraine for a long time. And the ultimate goal is for them to join the EU. And the ultimate goal is for them to probably join NATO. And if they don't join NATO, they have to have like a way, Dr. Fever is closer to this stuff than I am, but they're going to need to have all the top shelf weapons. They're going to have access to all the cool stuff. So they can have like a Sweden or Finland thing where they're not a member of NATO, but they could just do it in a minute, like they just did, or Israel gets access to all the top shelf stuff. We don't have a treaty agreement with Israel, but everyone kind of knows like we'll support them. But just in Ukraine, my last thing I'll say is like we ought to give them gobs of assistance, but there's like two things that can happen. One is like they have a Huawei tech backbone. So I know like I've talked about Huawei and a little bit of, you think I may be a little bit obsessed about it. People, we're doing like billions of dollars. They need to take that thing out of the ground and burn it. Like they cannot have a Huawei tech backbone. I'm sorry. Like if you want to get access to the top shelf weapons, think we're gonna like send all the secret stuff on some Huawei tech backbone? Hell no. So I'm your friend. I wear the t-shirt. I got the Ukraine t-shirt. Okay. Like no one can say they're more pro-Ukraine than me. They cannot have a Huawei tech backbone. They got to get rid of that. The second thing is, if when this is over, they say we're going to hire a couple of fine Chinese construction firms to rebuild the country, you just play that one out. Okay, that's a deal killer. And the other thing, the Chinese are financing the Russian war machine every day. And if you say like what the argument is for Republicans, there's like two arguments. One is like the Star Wars bar of bad guys is back in Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, get up every morning and hope and pray if they pray. Some of them don't, that Russia wins. And the second one is around religious persecution. So Speaker Johnson is a devout Baptist. If you're a Baptist in Russian occupied Ukraine, you're having a really bad day. They are oppressing Christians in the Russian occupied Ukraine every day. So if you want to move Republicans, it's not, I mean, they can read my white papers and maybe they do, maybe they don't. But what's going to move them is like, are Christians being oppressed in Russian occupied Ukraine? And the fact that the bad guys are, the bad guys, if Russia has a clear-cut victory, it's going to embolden the other bad guys, including the Chinese, to do Taiwan.
Right.
So on that optimistic note, let's open it. But let's see if there are a few questions from the audience.
Yeah.
All right. So maybe we can get into that. I don't know how we do questions here. Anyone know how we do questions here? I pick. Okay. All right. I'm gonna just run to people with a microphone. Have a microphone. I don't have to run. I saw your hand first.
I'm like dating myself, like Donahue. Remember, like Donahue?
Yes, and you run with it. Yeah. Wait. I do have to say one thing. I'm gonna help you out here. My kids explained to me that for the younger generation, it's not TGI Fridays. It's just Fridays.
Really?
Really. Just like last week.
Webs either?
No.
Called the interwebs?
No. I know it's crazy.
Right,
Anyway.
crazy. Sorry.
Yeah,
They have
definitely not the
vacuum
interwebs.
tubes in the interwebs? Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Well, I found this really interesting, and I have a couple of questions that are related. And maybe sort of I'll start with a claim, which is a lesson learned that China maybe took away from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that the United States can very quickly mobilize a multilateral sanctions regime that can prove to be quite constrictive. And so perhaps there's one lesson learned on that. But so sort of relatedly, it strikes me that the United States' economic statecraft does tend to be sanctions oriented. It tends to be the sticks. Whereas China's economic statecraft tends to favor the carrots. They tend to favor this Belt and Road, these other initiatives. And sort of what I was hearing from you is that you're talking about soft power, but it wasn't clear to me whether we're talking about these inducements in the forms of investments and aid and things like that, or whether we're talking about sanctions as well. And sort of if it is the former, it strikes me that foreign aid is quite unpopular in the U.S. electorate in terms of wanting to spend money on, like you sort of mentioned it later, like we're spending money on Ukraine versus sending them weapons or sending them things that can then be sold by American companies to the countries that we're trying to do business with. So I guess this is a long-winded way of asking you, when you say soft power, are we talking the carrots and the sticks? Are we talking one or the other? And then sort of relatedly, you mentioned in great detail about how the United States can sort of engage in this great power competition with China via its relationships with African countries and other countries in the developing world. And I'm wondering if you've thought further on how the United States can engage in its soft power with China, meaning like, are there ways where the United States can have a coercive leverage via its soft power to change Chinese behavior, if not like if directly? Yeah.
Gosh, thank you. Those are a lot of thoughtful questions and comments. Should I just respond? Should I go ahead, sir? Okay. Okay. So first, so if I was going to write this book again, so my book, which the American Imperative, Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power. So Frank Luntz, you have to repeat it like 7 times, and that's how you remember. So I think I've said it like 5 times. So I don't encompass all of the different kinds of things that I consider soft power. So I would say my simplistic thing is to say, if it's not ATACMS, battleships, or like CIA, like I consider kind of like in the sort of broadly ecumenically soft power. But I think there are a number of things I omit in my book. So like if I was going to do a second book, I would do a book just on public diplomacy as like an strategic communications, public diplomacy. I have almost nothing in it in here. And if I was going to do another book, it would be on that. And because I think that's part of it. I do think sanctions are a part of this conversation. I agree with you. And I don't see anything about sanctions. I could have done there's been a book called The Economic Weapon that came out recently. You probably are familiar with it. And so there's a couple of other books that talk about this. So I don't go into much depth on the sanctions regime, but yes, I also think we can kind of max out the sanctions credit card. And so you're seeing countries say, well, how do I use Bitcoin or whatever the heck? How do I get around the dollar thing and not use whatever it is? You know what I'm talking about? Like those systems, someone will tell me what it's called, but you know what I'm talking about, right? That system for moving the dollars around. Like I don't want that. So I agree. I think China learned that lesson. I also think Russia, there's the woman who I think is the central bank president of Russia, is a very, very, unfortunately, is a very able technocrat and has been getting ready for this for a while. Like she's been preparing for this. She was like getting ready for winter and like accumulated money and like had a whole, she's probably one of the most able technocrats. She's unfortunately works for like a it's like working for Adolf Hitler and saying this person's like a competent bureaucrat, right? It's not that extreme, but she's in that, it's a terrible authoritarian, very evil regime. And she's a very competent bureaucrat for a very able and evil, very evil regime and very odious regime. Okay, so I think it also includes things like commercial diplomacy. I don't talk a lot about that. I think in this new age, we have to do a better job. We have something like 12 foreign and commercial service officers on the continent of Africa. I think we have like 12 foreign and commercial service officers in like one city in Germany or something. Like we don't, I think we have to do a better job on that. We need to kind of revamp and rethink that for this new age. I think the trade agenda, like all of our trade agreements, all of them have a geopolitical oomph behind them. That's a think tank term, oomph, but like there's like a geopolitical or a geostrategic or even geoeconomic like reason. Like when we did NAFTA or USMCA, there was like another thing behind it. When President Bush was leaving in 2008, his last thing was to try and get a trade deal with Colombia. Now, how much of that was just about like trade with Colombia? Like that was important, but there was like a whole bunch of other things attached to it. So like the reason we had the European Union was like how do we like get these people all bound up together so they don't go to have another world war in Europe? So I think the trade agenda, like we've basically taken a timeout on trade since sort of like after like the first year of the Obama administration. And so we've had most of Obama, not all of it, but maybe let's say the second term of Obama, all of Trump, and this administration is really terrible on trade. And I just think, China's now the #1 trading partner for like 25 years ago, the United States was the #1 trading partner for like 120 countries, and China was the #1 trading partner for 60. Today, it's flipped. The #1 trading partner is China for 120 countries, and the #1 trading partner for other countries, 60 is the United States. So that has all sorts of implications. Like, so we go around in Latin America and say, well, we'll stop being nice to China. Like, well, they're my #1 trading partner. Or don't pay the debt, Zambia. Let's say, well, they're my number one trading partner. And if I get in a fight with them, I don't pay their debt, they're going to stop buying my rocks. They're going to stop buying my minerals. Right. And then they can't pay. Do you see what I mean? Like there's like, it has all sorts of other implications. So I think the trade agenda is part of this too. So I don't do a super good job in my book of, explicating all the different forms of soft power. I think I probably, if I do it, I kind of do it in sort of like a quick, just to kind of get it out of the way. But you're right. So the answer is you're right. And so if I was going to do a second book, I will do something specifically on public diplomacy and strategic communications. I think it's such a big thing I don't talk about in here. But the other things you reference, I agree with you. Yes.
Right, maybe take one, how about right here on the, yeah, sorry.
Thank you, and thank you for being here tonight. I wanted to go back to your work with the Romney campaign.
Yeah. I'm going to start crying. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you might, because I think, one very famous outcome of the Romney campaign, or one very famous moment, was during the debates when Obama basically mocked Romney for his
On
statement
Russia.
that Russia was,
Yep.
The greatest threat
remember.
to the United States.
I remember.
Why were people not ready for that observation? Why did people not see that? And what was the Romney team looking at differently that allowed them to kind of see that?
So I would love to take credit for like the whole Russia thing. I think it was Leon Aaron. There was a guy who I think is at Tufts who later died, Bill somebody whose name escapes him, Peter. I don't know if you, I have to go find, there was like a list of like the experts that came out in 2011. And there were two co-chairs of the Russia thing, the Russia working group. And I think it was these two folks that kind of like said this is a problem. Yeah. And so Obama said, well, the 80s want their foreign policy back, and people laughed. And so I'm in the swamp, right? I'm in establishment foreign policy. So all of my peers who are not Republicans were like snickering and like, he's stupid. And boy, is that dumb. They're not saying that anymore, right? But this was before 2014 and before a whole bunch of other things. And so, I don't know. I would say that I think there was a hope that I think that whether it's China or Russia, I do think there's been attempts to say, okay, well, we put so much effort into trying to help support Russia from sort of like after the fall of the Berlin Wall to, I don't know, really to kind of the beginning of Obama. There was an attempt to say, like, how do we engage? They were part of the G8, and we had a foreign aid program in Russia till about 2010, maybe something like that. 2010. So I think that I think it's sort of like a sunk cost theory, and like, well, we put all this effort into it, and also if the Republicans are saying, well, they're stupid, and there's a little bit of that. It's my team doesn't agree, and so they're dumb and we're smart, and there was a little bit of that. I think that's true. So I think that it was a mix of things. It's very cold comfort to be like, oh, we were right. Like, I'm not gonna say I was like part of that, but like I could associate myself and say we were right. But yeah, I just would say we've got a problem, and I think we have a collective challenge now with them. And so I think ultimately we're going to need a bipartisan consensus on what. So I think there's a bipartisan consensus in Washington that we have a problem with the Chinese Communist Party. And there's a bipartisan consensus we have a problem with the Vladimir Putin's murderous regime. We're still in the process of kind of groping our way towards a bipartisan consensus about what the hell to do about this. It's both in the military and the non-military space. So we can, like, we all know, like, okay, we hate on Russia, but like, well, what should we do about that? Is as a contested question. And then like, okay, we don't like the Chinese Communist Party. What should we do about this is up for debate. So I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, it's a thank you for raising that. Yes, you're correct. Yes.
So I think we need to wrap it up. Is that true? We have time for one more? Okay,
one more.
excellent. One more. Let's come
Last
back over
call.
to the side of the room and just kind of bounce it
Last
back and
call.
forth here.
So we talked about delineating between the regimes of China and Russia and the civilian population,
Yeah.
and the U.S. needing to engage with the civilian
Yes.
populations of these places. How do you think about that as it relates to like a heavily propagandized population, and regimes that use propaganda very heavily. And how do you think about the U.S.'s role in combating that propaganda?
Yeah.
If the U.S. has any ability to go into like a foreign country and combat that,
100%. Okay, so first, this came up earlier. So I actually think it's a good thing that we have something like 300,000 Chinese students studying in the United States. And if you know Chinese students, you should make them feel welcome at Duke, and they should be. I would also say something a little bit more controversial. I'd like to have some Russian students. And there's not a lot of Russians coming and studying in the U.S. right now. And so the more of those folks, the better. That's a good thing. And that helps. So people-to-people connectivity, like we have almost zero right now with China. Some of it because of COVID. Like all of you, many of you probably been to China. How many of you been to China the last 36 months? Anybody been in China the last 36 months? No. Some of it's like, am I going to get arrested? Are they going to like steal my phone? Or right? Some of it's that. Some of it's like their extreme COVID lockdown stuff. Like I don't want to get locked down for a month in some roach motel or whatever, in some thing, right? You know what I'm talking about. So we need more connectivity. So when I do this talk with like World Affairs Councils in places like Nashville, I say, I need you to get on a plane right now and you need to go to China. And you have a sister city in some city I can't find on a map in China. You get your butt there right now. Take your mayor and go. Like if you said, like, so I think we need people to people. So I think we need people to people connectivity. Like our current U.S. ambassador is one of our finest diplomats. I think Nick Burns. He used, I think, the term ballast in our relationship with China, like the people to people thing and the commercial stuff is our ballast. We don't have it right now. So we need some of that. Okay. So I said earlier about this. We're not super good at like public diplomacy stuff or like counting. We can say like, well, that's misinformation or disinformation, but it's kind of like throwing a fit. I think we have to do a better job of like, I don't understand, like we can communicate, like we can market Coca-Cola or Pepsi. I think North Carolina is Pepsi, right? So we can market Pepsi, but we can have Pepsi all over the world, but we can't seem to kind of like message or we don't, and some of it is a cultural thing in sort of our diplomatic culture. Some of it is some leftover, there was a law that was passed, I think it's called Smith-Mundt, which was like, we don't want the American government doing propaganda on our own population. So like it's created like a series of kind of fears within sort of like, oh, are we going to do something that's going to somehow like, propagandize. There's a really interesting book by a guy, I think it's Maxwell Hamilton, he's at University of Louisiana, Baton Rouge, about kind of propaganda, U.S. propaganda in World War One. I think it's Hamilton. Anyways, it's a history of kind of American propaganda in World War One, and I think a lot of it was a reaction to some of the stuff that happened in World War One on some of it. And so we need to do a better job of that. Some of it we don't have to do. So we haven't talked a lot about allies or friends and burden sharing. Some of our partners are going to be better messengers than us. Like sometimes we're just probably like sometimes in some instances not going to be the right messenger. So we just in general need to do a better job in this new age. Like so, we had kind of like a flurry of thinking about public diplomacy after 9/11. I think we're going to need to kind of revisit our communications for this age with competition with China and Russia. And I also think some of these folks really believe this stuff. So like I go back to earlier, like you don't hear the Russians say they may believe they want Finland back or something, but they never say they're going to do it because they had a bad experience. I want the Russians, like, I don't know if I can convince them over there, but I want them to be like, I want to take a timeout on invading Ukraine for 100 years. That's what I want. So whether I convince them or not, I want to be like, that hot stove was so hot that I'm not going to touch the hot stove again. I say, don't touch the hot stove. Like, I burn myself on a hot stove. You know what I mean?
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I actually heard lots of things in there about what we could or could be doing better, which is a great message, I think, for students at a university, because a lot of you are going to be the ones going out there, hopefully doing it better. So I think that is some great notes to end on. If you could all join me in thanking Daniel Runde for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Looking to the people who are in charge now to see what happens.
We're dismissed. Thank you.